Well, one of the basic issues of Rwanda is it's an overpopulated country. It's not just a country with a large population. It's got 11 million at this very moment, but it's 420 people per square kilometer, which is the highest in Africa, and even more than the Netherlands, where I come from, which is known to have a very high population density. That means there are too many people for too little land, so there is dispute over land. And basically agricultural productivity is very low, not because they don't work hard enough, but they don't have enough land basically to generate a margin from their agricultural production. And if you look at Rwanda, they were at fertility levels of something like 8.2 in the early 80s, which was clearly much too much. It came down to something like 6.2 in 1992. Then the civil war broke out, which culminated in the genocide in 1994, and you find that fertility levels remained at that same level of 6.2 as long as 2005. So that was a reason for us to sort of try and tease out the causes of that very high level of fertility. Now, there are many different issues at work there. The first, obviously, is to what extent do people actually want to have a lot of children? If that's true, then obviously it's very hard to bring it down. And we looked at it, looked at the fertility preferences, and we did indeed find that in 2000, 95, 2000, an awful lot of women indicated that they wanted to have 5 children or more, and it's close to 70%. So fertility preferences were very high at that very moment. So we looked whether that could be related to actual loss of children in the period before and the loss of siblings. And obviously it turned out that losing children is a very strong impetus in wanting to have more. I mean, that's a general finding from the literature, which was corroborated with the evidence that we had. We also found that the actual fertility levels were even higher than the desired fertility levels. Meaning that if they would have had the number of children they actually wanted, the fertility levels 2000 would not have been 6.1, but would have been closer to 4.6. Another issue in the longer run is that part of that high fertility also means that birth spacing is contracting, so people get children very quickly. And it's also known from the literature that has negative effects on the life chances of their children. So that was the third project where we looked at how does that work. Do we indeed find reduction in birth spacing, which we found. Cultural customs in Rwanda actually specify long periods of breastfeeding, so long birth intervals, and actually that deteriorated as well in the 90s, meaning rising levels of child mortality, which again is an impetus, even after the war, of having many children. So taking that together, basically what we could conclude is that if reproductive services would be in place, fertility could be decreased very, very rapidly. And one of the very nice projects that we're doing is we're looking at educational achievement, looking at the crowding out effects of that older siblings have on the younger siblings have on their older siblings. So for the children from wealthy families, there was hardly any effect of having an extra sibling. That means that you can still complete primary education, which is obviously the first step in moving into secondary education. Now, the higher the level of poverty, the stronger the effects became of an extra sibling. If it's also the poor people that cannot stop their childbearing, then obviously there's a sort of double jeopardy here, that they're confined both to poor households, meaning also that the decision of having children work and contribute to the household income, or having them completed their primary education, obviously turns out differently. So having less children in poor families improves the chances for a better education of the children at that level. If you add it up to the national level, it also solves, well, perhaps not solves, but contributes to the solution of one of the major problems in Rwanda is that they have not been able to keep up with the educational services to the enormous population growth, meaning that schools are overcrowded, there's a lack of teachers, there's a lack of schools buildings. So they work shifts at this moment. You have a morning shift, pupils coming in at 7:30 or 8 o'clock, and then until the early afternoon, and the second shift comes in. Obviously meaning that the quality of the education is definitely not in place as it should be. So you find that very few of the ones that are 13-year-olds, which is the statutory age at which primary education ends, fail to take the final exam, which is a national examination. And many have to continue after age 13. And it's particularly the poor children with a lot of siblings that are not able to continue, have to drop out of school, basically having limited resources in their future lifetime. So reducing the number of children, because at the current projections, the number of under 14-year-olds in Rwanda will be something like 7.2 million. If you could bring it down quickly, say in a few years' time, that would actually mean that population pressure on the schools would be less, and you would have money not to invest in even more schools of more teachers, but improving the current schooling at this very moment. And they've been very successful. Actually, within 5 years' time, Rwanda has managed to bring down actual fertility from 6.1 to 4.6 in a period of 5 years. It's amazing. If you look at our research, it's not amazing. It's basically, there were a lot of women already in 2005 that wanted to reduce their childbearing. There were a lot of women that actually wanted to have access to reproductive services, and basically if you change the conditions and people can live according to their preferences and their ideas, that really helps. And basically the conditions were there, which is different in other countries. We made some comparison with other East African countries, and these situations are really different from Rwanda. Rwanda also, the poor people are actually aware that having a lot of children is not benefiting their children nor themselves. And that might be related, we're not sure, but it might be related to the fact that they do own very little land. So it doesn't help you to have extra offspring, because it doesn't generate extra agricultural production, so it doesn't add to the household resources. That's known in the literature as poverty Malthusianism, that poor people actually want to reduce the number of children because they simply can't afford to have more, which we found in some interviewing, people actually saying that. How many children would you want? And they said, well, you shouldn't have more than you can support, which is a totally different way of looking at it than assuming that children would always add to the household resources or being an insuring for old age. Because basically if you can't support them, it'll mean poverty for all of them, including yourself. So this is perhaps peculiar for Rwanda. It might not work in other countries. We didn't look at, could we generalize our findings, but you do find more places where actually densities are high and agricultural productivity is low. And if you want to increase agricultural productivity, it's not going to work with having extra hands on the land. Raising agricultural productivity will have to come from technological innovation that are there already but have to be put in place. And you would have to build a different type of economy where actually human capital is needed rather than more land. If you have a concerted effort working on these different aspects of the issue, because it's very complex, and you can sort of move the conditions into a system where people would actually accept having practicing modern contraceptive, then you find that you can move very quickly into lower fertility levels. And I think that's basically the reason why the Rwandan success, as it's being dubbed at this moment at conferences, is actually on its way. It's not a single issue. It's not just building infrastructure. There's much more to it. And I think that's where research helps, is to uncover that sort of underlying issues in a society that would actually sort of generate the conditions for lower population growth and improvement of the quality of life.